I recently played through Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and over the course of the game, one thought continually popped into my head. Man, this game is fun. I swear I must have thought that at least 50 times over the course of my 20-hour playthrough. I mean, does it get much better than destroying a bunch of boxes with a wrench? Once the credits finally rolled, I reflected on the experience and started to wonder why this game in particular kept me coming back to that 3-letter word. I mean, sure, the game is just really good, but I play a ton of really good games that don't exactly have me spelling F-U-N. Could it be that modern games are starting to place more emphasis on immersion and presentation while losing sight of what makes them satisfying to play? We may as well just ask, are video games even fun anymore?
I'm on my way, buddy. Just hang in there for a little bit longer.
Now, that's obviously a big question to pose. Before I attempt to answer it, I want to dig into a few elements of Rift Apart that I think make it so much fun. Not just good, but fun specifically. In the process, I'm going to compare each element against a modern game that approaches that element differently. The first component that struck me about Ratchet & Clank was its immediacy. Rift Apart is quick in virtually every regard. Its narrative, for example, operates at a breakneck pace. No cutscene ever lasts more than a couple of minutes, and each one is filled to the brim with snappy cuts and concise exposition.
Clank!
The design of the game also reflects this mentality. Unless you opt to stick around to explore or complete side objectives, you never stay in any one level for more than 30 to 45 minutes. Your objective is always straightforward and clearly marked, with the path to success filled with varied scenarios. You're never doing the same thing for very long, and while you'll of course take part in a lot of shooting, that too operates at a fast tempo, with both you and your enemies dodging and blasting around to emerge victorious. Everything just feels so energetic and dynamic, reminiscent of games from yesteryear that knew how to get to the point. In thinking of modern titles that adopt a more methodical approach, one game quickly came to mind. Red Dead Redemption 2 offers a fundamentally different experience from Ratchet & Clank, particularly in terms of its pacing. From the get-go, it's clear that Red Dead places massive priority on grounding you in its world. Perhaps the most clear example of this is the way in which you navigate the space around you. Like virtually any open-world game, Red Dead 2 features a fast travel system, but it's very tucked away and can't be used at any time. The game pushes you to simply ride your horse from point A to B, which can sometimes take as long as 10 or more minutes if crossing a huge stretch of the map. This is in stark contrast to Rift Apart, which finds you traveling at light speed between planets on a regular basis. Additionally, Red Dead Redemption 2 features light survival elements not seen in its predecessor. For example, you need to eat food in order to maximize your potential health and stamina. You need to adjust your clothing relative to the temperature of your environment to maintain optimum performance. These components are a far cry from genuine survival games, but are still mechanical additions that change how the game is played, inviting a quiet whisper in your mind to perpetually track your hunger levels. These additions may seem subtle, and in practice they are, but they create a different kind of experience than what you get from Ratchet & Clank, an experience so predicated on the immediate moment. When you're blasting bad guys, that's the only thing on your mind. That's not to say that Red Dead 2 doesn't feature fast-paced moments and gripping action, it absolutely does, but it doles those elements out more sparingly. So what's the ideal approach here? Do these differences make one of these games better than the other? Well, hold that thought. The next element that struck me about Rift Apart is its difficulty, or should I say, lack thereof. No matter how you slice it, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is just an easy game. Now, yes, there are harder difficulty settings and a more challenging New Game Plus mode unlocked once you complete the game, but for the sake of this discussion, I played Rift Apart on normal difficulty, which presented a decidedly breezy experience. Combat was very forgiving, with enemies that struggled to keep pace, and plentiful health drops if I ever started to flirt with disaster. That's not to say I never died, I definitely did, but it was more often due to falling during optional platforming sections. Even when you do kick the bucket, the game quickly reloads you back into the action, typically just seconds before your previous failure. It may sound like I'm complaining about the game's easy nature, but I actually really enjoyed it. It enabled a smooth rhythm of progression where I hardly ever felt like I wasn't steadily making progress. Compare that to, well, you can probably guess. Unsurprisingly, we're talking Dark Souls. I'm showing Dark Souls 3 for the sake of the footage, but this discussion certainly encompasses the entire trilogy. It seems that just about everyone is familiar with the franchise at this point, but if you're not, the Dark Souls series is predicated on punishing difficulty. At a base level, the games feature rigorous combat that requires precise, carefully timed reflexes in order to overcome. Even low-level rank-and-file enemies can deplete your health bar with just a few hits, forcing persistent vigilance on the part of the player. That's not to mention the brutal boss fights that often feel as though they demand perfection. All of these foes are wrapped in a world that feels antagonistic in and of itself, with traps and hazards around every corner. If all of that weren't enough, death carries far more consequence than a simple reload. Failure means respawning at a location that's often a serious hike from where you just died. Enemies also respawn when you do, meaning that getting back to where you were in an effort to pick up your dropped experience points is much easier said than done. As rewarding as the Dark Souls games can be, they unapologetically present an experience that demands trial and error. An experience that demands tinkering with your strategies countless times in an effort to take down that next boss that seems to be completely insurmountable. It couldn't be further from Rift Apart's easy breezy pace that essentially ensures you're never dealing with the same scenario for more than a couple of minutes.
What's so special about the blimp?
Just find a way up to that rooftop. I gotta grab my gear.
Before we dig into our core question, I want to highlight one more element of Ratchet & Clank: its tone. I'd played one other Ratchet & Clank game a few years ago, so I knew what to expect to some degree, but still, I was struck when starting Rift Apart by just how wholesome it is. The world, characters, and dialogue all contribute to what often feels as much like the next movie from DreamWorks as it does a video game. Jokes are cracked at a relentless pace, and even when conflict occurs, the participants are quick to smooth things over through healthy communication. Seldom did the writing actually make me laugh, and oftentimes I found it to be a little too sweet for my tastes, but its family-friendly nature is just refreshing and pleasant to be a part of. Again, it takes me back to an older era, where colorful mascots with bizarre proportions ruled the gaming roost, before things took a decidedly darker tone.
Don't make a fucking sound. Hands up.
The Last of Us series as a whole presents a notably grim experience, but The Last of Us Part 2 in particular is, plainly stated, the darkest game I think I've ever played. I won't be digging into any story spoilers here, so don't worry if you haven't played it yet, but suffice it to say, the narrative of The Last of Us Part 2 delves into some incredibly heavy territory. It's bleak, it's violent, it's, well, let's just say, completely antithetical to this. And it's not just the story's content that's mature, but how it's told. Exposition can unfold very slowly, and the story plays with time in a way that demands patience and faith from the player. It's a slow burn that makes many controversial decisions. This macabre atmosphere also permeates the moment-to-moment gameplay, with ample violence on display during the many combat sections. Video games have continued to incorporate violence more and more as the medium has aged, but there's a grounded quality to how it's portrayed in The Last of Us Part 2 that really sets it apart. Each person you kill clearly suffers and even tends to have a name. The realism with which the violence is portrayed is something rarely attempted. It lends weight to each kill and is incredibly affecting, but can be difficult to play in long stretches if you're not in the appropriate state of mind. In short, it's intense and reflects an increasingly explicit medium, a reality that makes a game like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart all the more noteworthy.
Fuck. That was dumb.
I want to make it very clear that these comparisons aren't meant to display these games in a negative light relative to Rift Apart. In fact, all three of these games received higher aggregate reviews than Ratchet & Clank and are some of the most celebrated titles of the last generation. Red Dead Redemption 2 creates an absolutely breathtaking open world, complete with one of the most layered protagonists in video game history. Dark Souls 3 acts as a rewarding, arduous finale to one of the most influential trilogies of the last 20 years. The Last of Us Part 2 manages to set a new benchmark for my favorite developer. Of course, as I alluded to in this video's introduction, that's not to say that every good game is necessarily fun. That word possesses a jovial, childlike association, at least for me, despite what its textbook definition may claim. Am I having fun when riding horseback for 10 minutes straight, or when facing the same boss for the 30th time? or sneakily taking someone out with a shank? Maybe fun isn't the optimal word, but am I entertained? Without question. As this medium continues to grow and mature, games are continuing to push the boundaries of what fun looks like. Maybe a video game needs to build up to its fun. This may sound silly, but think about a great movie. You may not be entertained from the get-go, but as you become more familiar with the film's world and characters, so too does your investment increase. Maybe there's something to be said for a game that takes its time through methodical storytelling, or a game that demands extreme skill from the player. For many people, an experience like that may be exactly the kind of fun they're looking for. So yes, as you may have been able to guess, I do think video games are absolutely still fun. But ultimately, what you and I find fun may be very different. I found Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart to be fun, but so too did I find fun in Red Dead Redemption, Dark Souls, and The Last of Us. There's a pretty good chance you're not into all 4 of these series, and that's okay. That fact just highlights the incredible eclecticism that video games have grown to possess. Innumerable genres provide opportunity for virtually anyone to find a corner of the medium that they connect with. Developers of all sizes continue to push the envelope of what fun can look like, which at the end of the day is a victory for all of us. I don't think video games as a whole will ever stop being fun, but the form that fun takes will continue to expand and diversify. Personally, I can't wait to see how the medium grows next, but man, destroying those boxes, that'll never get old.